Hi, welcome to Sustain Talks, the podcast crafted to enlighten individuals and businesses on the path to becoming more sustainable and socially responsible. I'm Sam Candy, CEO of Responsible Futures, an organisation that supports businesses through consulting and training. Today, I am delighted to be in conversation with Philipp Von Lamezan, co-founder and CEO of SQUAKE, a company that helps businesses achieve their climate goals and drives the mobility transition to net zero, and who have developed an API that enables companies in the travel and logistics sectors to calculate their emissions in real time. I recently came across SQUAKE at the Business Travel Show, and I have to say I was genuinely impressed with their technology. So I'm looking forward to getting into the conversation today. Philip, welcome. How are you?
Thank you so much. Very well. What about you?
I'm good, thank you. So let's start a little bit with your personal journey into sustainability and a bit about SQUAKE, what inspired you to create SQUAKE. Let's hear from you.
Yeah, great. So I think what got me into sustainability was eventually starting with my studies, which was industrial engineering. I focused on aviation, basically. So I'm pretty familiar with the space. I'm also pretty familiar with the fact that it is incredibly hard to change this infrastructure from fossil fuels as the main propellant towards less emitting fuel alternatives, right? And pretty much after 10 years of building tech companies and tech solutions in the market, I really wanted to do something about creating viable solutions for a new business sector, but really also tackling one of the big challenges we have as a society. And that was basically then the starting point for me to engage with my co-founding partner, Dan, who at the time was working at Lufthansa Innovation Hub, and discovered or basically developed the primary technology, basically, which SQUAKE then also extended as an independent company.
Okay, and just for those that don't know SQUAKE, can you just tell a little bit more about what it is and what it does?
Right. So you mentioned already travel and logistics, but overall, what SQUAKE does is we help companies to achieve their climate and especially their carbon targets. And what we did and what we do is basically we developed an end-to-end solution platform really to understanding where your company is in context of carbon emission baseline, setting up targets. How do you want to reduce those emissions year over year, 5%, 10%, to achieve your certain goal threshold at some stage 2030 or 2035. And then from the planning and targeting phase, the next big phase is the action plan, right? How do you put this into motion? And in there, we basically have a full toolkit, especially targeting corporate travel managers, but also the respective counterparts on the logistics side, enabling carbon visibility at point of decision, at point of sale. So in the booking flows, in the administration flows, embedding carbon emission transparency right at the core of the service. And then beyond that, obviously, there's so much you can do in terms of avoiding emissions in the first place, but that is a problem about this industry. As soon as you move from A to B, and whether this is transport of people or transport of goods, there will be emissions left over. And that is where our second big solution arm comes into play, which is carbon reduction and removal. So we have a whole team concerned with vetting and analyzing the market and partnering up with carbon credit developers and providers, as well as fuel providers of sustainable fuels, which can be distributed as well through our solution kit.
That's great. I think, the bit that I love about it is that transparency at the point of booking, which I think so many travel managers, I'm very connected with a lot of the travel industry, and actually some of our clients that are trying to manage their travel, and that transparency is the bit that, you are able to make a decision if you can see what it is that you're doing and the options, and that helps with the reduction. Let's talk a little bit more about the travel industry, because they're facing regulatory pressure, but also consumer demand for sustainability. How do you see that companies can balance those pressures whilst maintaining profitability? That's the thing that it's about, isn't it? People need to travel, they want to travel, but there's that pressure with sustainability or going to the meeting.
Yeah. So a couple of points you're addressing here. One is the pressure side of things towards companies. The other part then is basically an acknowledgement that sustainability comes at a price. So travel and logistics as well have huge benefits. It's vital for our society, for the development and the evolution of our society, to meet in person. So that is very important to state up front. There's a huge value in being amongst one another and meeting face to face. At the same time, the implications of travel, especially as it will take a couple of more decades until we have emission-free flight and transport infrastructure, comes at a cost, and that is basically environmental cost. So in regards to external pressure, to answer your first part of the question, CSRD, so regulatory forces, really kick in now harder and harder, and there's different waves coming, especially within the European Union, forcing different sizes of companies at different points in time to report their carbon emissions. And then obviously beyond that also, it is the question not just to report about it, but where corporate travel managers often enough struggle is not to just report, but put this into action and put into motion a reduction plan. And if they don't have tools, they can run around with PowerPoints and hope that people comply. But our fundamental belief is that only when you embed carbon emissions, both on the transparency, but also on the compensation, and therefore the cost side of things, into the core process, it will become a natural, informed, and better educated decision-making process for each of the respective bookings of a travel or business trip.
Yeah, that really leads nicely into my next question, which I think that people are really interested in sustainable options, but their booking behavior doesn't reflect that. How do you think that companies can overcome this gap and make more sustainable choices, more accessible, and appeal to their customers?
Yeah. So I think we have to differentiate here between B2B and B2C businesses.
Yeah.
And in the B2C world, we believe that there is a strong point in filling in the customer. So making relatable what is going on, what the implications of travel are, not in a finger pointing way, but really just informing, hey, this has some additional impact, which is in environmental terms, not the best. And to compensate for that, there is different ways, because our infrastructure and aircraft and so on are not yet there, and also not in the next 10 or 20 years at scale, to not have any emissions released from flight activities. And those come then at a cost, where you talk about sustainable fuels, for instance, which are amazing because they can be used by the existing aircraft types, right? And there's no new oils which you need to extract from the soil, but you reuse existing volumes basically of oils. However, all of that you have to explain in a very short amount of time in a booking flow, which basically has a different purpose, which is you wanna book for getting from A to B. So it's a fine balance between making that information available, finding the right tone, and reducing the complexity of what I just explained in a minute to a couple of words, and then dig deeper upon request. And that is the challenge on the B2C segment. I think on the B2B side, it is a little bit different because through regulation and through basically the market demanding more and more sustainable solutions, emitting carbon emissions or producing carbon emissions by traveling a lot or shipping a lot creates an own cost, right? So we know several companies and clients of ours who by now have set up internal carbon ton fees, basically. For each ton, they set up internal fees which you have to pay on top of the actual travel or the logistics activities. And that creates an own business case where you can say, if you avoid X, Y, Z in terms of carbon emissions, you practically save having to pay the fee for carbon emissions on top, which becomes a business case in itself. And it will be, especially for large corporations and enterprises, a huge factor on the balance sheet to reduce, and as a first step to try to avoid creating additional emissions, and then only thereafter approaching the topic of carbon removal and reduction.
Yeah, I do think that, you know, and actually I've been saying this for a couple of years, and I do think that it will come that companies will have carbon budgets, especially around business travel, where they'll say, right, this is the carbon budget, because if they're getting to net zero, this is what our carbon budget is. We can't go above that. So how are we going to fit all of our meetings into that budget? And actually, that's why I love tools like yours, because it can help with the carbon budgeting of what they can and can't do, especially because, you know, as you say, and I don't know, will it ever become emission free? We are 20, maybe even 30 years away from this being potentially emission free. And by then it's going to be too late. So I think it's really important for that understanding of what is it that we're doing, and how can we educate our travelers and our travel bookers to understand exactly what this means and means for our set amount. You have talked before about climate conscious options isn't enough, and that companies have to communicate them effectively. And gosh, I've seen so many mistakes, and actually the ASA are really, really gunning for a lot of companies, especially in the travel industry. What are some common communication mistakes that you see when it comes to promoting sustainable, you know, let's talk about business travel, because we're this is a big B2B business community.
Yeah. So I think overall there's multiple layers to this, and one big differentiation one has to take here is it actually about having an impact, so reducing carbon emissions, or is it about a pure marketing story? And what we've seen in the past is often enough that there were instances where maybe there was a communication around the greenest flight or the greenest travel out there. all of that basically is greenwashing, because there is no green travel per se, right? There are more sustainable and less sustainable options, and I think that is what is important to acknowledge and is important to communicate as well. There's better choices and there's worse choices. Overall, getting from A to B by any means will produce to some extent carbon emissions.
Mm.
And putting that in proportion is the only way to go. Putting superlatives into that, where you claim to be this and that, and put that into a corner of super green or completely sustainable, will always be challenged, and rightfully challenged, by the market and by press. So either way, it's a very complex topic. I also don't believe that every of the greenwashing scandals out there have been intentional, in terms of trying to state something which was intentionally wrong. But as it's a complex topic, and maybe a marketing department is not as deep into it as a sustainability expert, knowing to differentiate exactly what can be communicated and what should not be communicated, there might be a discrepancy between a good intention and a bad communication about it.
Yeah.
So therefore, the first and foremost advice for any company out there is talk to experts and have experts go through any internal and external communication, to clarify what is right to say and what is wrong to say.
Yeah.
And the good news about that is the market is waking up to that. So there's a lot of regulatory change happening, with the Green Claims Initiative in the European Union, for instance, where it's more and more strict about how to communicate about such topics. And that will help to overall educate the market and the awareness of what is actually more sustainable, what is actually a better choice, and what is a bad choice.
Yeah, I do think you're right. And I think a lot of this comes down to education. And I agree. I think so many people in a marketing position, because they're not sustainability experts, they don't understand exactly how to present that. And actually, we find that a lot in our training, especially when we go into companies that work in the travel industry, that, there's a word that you can add, which is, this is what we're doing to be more sustainable, and that word changes everything. That you can see that companies are trying to do their bit, but that, it's about being truthful and honest about what you're trying to do, without saying, hey, we, without trying to cover up and sell more of, because of your sustainability, when it's something that's not sustainable. There's so much skepticism when it comes to carbon offsetting, and I think especially in the travel industry, because when, like 3 years ago, it was, okay, great, we can just plant trees and that's it, and now we can just carry on traveling and business as usual. And a lot of companies in this industry really jumped on that bandwagon, which I found really painful, actually, because I fully believe in nature, in nature-based solutions, and in protecting nature and supporting nature. So how do you ensure that, because offsetting is a solution that you also do offer, but how do you ensure that it's transparent, but also honest, and you're not just allowing people to, here's our tick box, that's it, we've done.
Yeah. So I think coming to the mentioned bandwagon of, oh, okay, that's the solution, let's go. Covering that first, because I think already that in itself is a problematic approach. this shift in the industry will not just consist of we do whatever we did in the past, and here's some compensation happening on the side. Let's continue. But it will be, as mentioned earlier, creating more awareness, creating transparency to have better and well-educated choices, choosing for trips, choosing for booking classes, going train instead of flight, going round trip instead of 2 times within a week to different places. All of that can contribute, and this is basically also what we are known for, that it is not just about creating reporting, but creating and providing tools to the corporate travel management programs to put into action in the first place to avoid additional emissions. And only when that happened, then we come to the realization that within our existing transport infrastructure, there will be still plenty of carbon emissions left. And there will very likely be a gap between what you set yourself as a, for instance, as a company, as a carbon emission target for travel, and what you realize not sacrificing too much of the travel. And that is where carbon compensation, reduction, and removal come into place. In there, you have all these different categories, and I spare you the details, but we have a whole team basically just making sure to vet the market, to analyze what is available in what form, and so on and so forth. But there's different categories and they have different implications. So you mentioned nature-based solutions, reforestation, renaturation, and so on and so forth. But there's also the other category, which is tech-based solutions, right? Direct carbon air capture, and so on and so forth. And then independence of how you look at these things, there's also very different categories of how you can slice all of these different solutions, whether it's nature-based, tech-based, removal, reduction, or avoidance as carbon credits, Oxford categories, etc., etc. So I spare you the details. The point is, either way, you have to make sure as a provider of these carbon credits and the fuel types, etc., that a client really understands what the implications of that is. So very simple example with sustainable fuels, you don't have to extract new oil from the grounds, but you use basically synthetic fuels to propel transport infrastructure. So that is what another case then, for instance, planting trees, which obviously take carbon from the air and through that grow and store it basically in the branches and in growing. So really getting into the level of detail to understand, the one thing is basically reducing new carbon emissions, extracting oils from the soil, etc., versus the other one is removing existing carbon from the air, which is, for instance, planting trees, and they're capturing carbon, or direct carbon air capture as a tech equivalent. That is very important to communicate. Now, that is the top layer between a client and ourselves. There's also additional layers which are vital, which is quality checks. And as I mentioned, we have a whole team just concerned with scanning the market, understanding what is available, vetting it. We have a 10-step process going through the documentation, through internal and external factors. We have 56 data points, which we go into depth and analyze whether a project is eligible to come onto our platform, or if we refuse basically to have specific projects being ran and administered through our infrastructure, because that eventually is not just protecting ourselves in terms of only good projects are going through the infrastructure, but eventually it's protecting our clients. right? So those layers, first of all, it's not about just directly going for compensation or reduction and removal, but first of all, it is about trying to avoid as much as possible through own actions. And the second step, it is making really sure that each of the parties, including the clients, really understand what they and what we are talking about when it comes to a specific project. And then in the background, what is happening through our team is an in-depth process of scanning the market, vetting specific projects on quality, and then only admitting them to the platform.
I love that. I really do, because I see such a, the offsetting industry is so unregulated right now. And the fact that you are actually taking responsibility yourselves to regulate it as much as you can within your business, so that there's transparency. I think that's really, really admirable, because I see so many companies out there, and there are thousands and thousands of them, that they're just doing it to make money. So the fact that you really are, and that, did you say 56-step process?
56, it's 56 data points. It's a 10-step process through different categories of analysis.
Yeah, that's amazing. You also are very optimistic about sustainable aviation fuel, maybe more so than I am, I will admit here. Talk me through your optimism, because I think that, yes, in 20, 30 years, there will be more options available, but that's 20, 30 years away when it's too late. We're 1% SAF at the moment, I believe, or 1.5%. That's not going to get us to net zero in time. And I'm also a little bit skeptic about where some of those fuels are coming from, the ones that are coming from the ground, or from the leftover chip fat oil in your local fish and chip shop, which there's never going to be enough in time. Well, you're really optimistic about it. Talk me through your views.
Yeah, I think so. Couple of thoughts on this. Overall, sustainable fuels are eventually one of the vital ways how to use an existing legacy infrastructure when it comes to fuel burning machinery, aircrafts, ships, all of that. So there is a way to accelerate less polluting. Now, the other part you mentioned, that sector is very hard to scale. There is the connotation in the market that there is too little SAF in the market. Let's stick with the aircraft or the airlines sector. That there is too little SAF available, and from a perspective of 1.5% availability over the remainders being fossil fuels, that might be right. But fuel providers do have enough volumes to cover for the demand existing at the moment. And the challenge here is not the volumes themselves, but it is the volumes at a certain price. And that is a challenge in itself. So obviously, sustainable fuels, when you look at the range of different carbon removal and compensation reduction schemes, is fairly expensive, right? It's on the high price side when you look at the cost per ton. And that hinders, obviously, a lot of participants along the travel and the logistics value chain to commit, because it doubles the price of a single ticket, just being on very rough numbers. So the only way to to approach this is basically to create step-by-step economies of scale. So the production price of the barrel or the liter of sustainable fuels gets closer and closer to what we know as a typical fossil fuel price. Will that be ever reached? Probably not in the foreseeable future. But the more demand we can create and the more we connect supply and demand, making things happen, we send signals to the industry, hey, please scale up your processes. And that again will lead to driving down pricing per ton or per liter equivalent, which then becomes a flywheel. Adoption rates will go up because the price is more affordable, and that will again facilitate and foster the adoption rates of more sustainable travel.
Right. Talking of innovation and future, what, if any, are there any innovations or emerging trends that really excite you the most in this sector and in sustainability?
So the good thing is there's a lot of tailwind for sustainability, despite we're having overall a challenging economic environment in the world or in Europe. And those tailwinds are, one, regulatory induced, but obviously also stakeholders, so employees of companies are challenging top management more and more. Hey, where are we going in terms of sustainability? Shareholders require that more and more. Loan givers, financial institutions, when they give out money, there is thresholds in terms of how sustainable a business can operate and should operate. So all of that is tailwinding basically this motion of introducing more sustainable options, and then through that reducing carbon emissions on a company level, but also on an individual level. That is great. What excites me about that is that we're seeing more and more a shift from a theoretical concept approach, where in Germany we have great debates around how this could be achieved and what form this could look like, and so on and so forth. But we're at the forefront of putting that theory into live motion and live action. And that is what excites me personally about our work at SQUAKE, but I see that more and more happening in the industry. So it's not just talks about it, but it is actual implications which you experience at the physical product, at the point of sale, in the talks within the industry with leading experts. So it's not just theory anymore. And I'm very excited to see how that, fast forwarding 12 months, turns out in form of tangible solutions left and right.
That's great. I honestly, I really enjoyed this conversation, because I talk a lot about the business travel industry and most of my clients are in it. So for me, this has been such a great conversation. And my final question would be, what advice would you give to business leaders who are a bit hesitant to integrate sustainability due to cost or complexity or education? What would your advice be?
Yeah. Especially in the travel industry,
Yeah.
We know that it is fairly fragmented in terms of tooling landscapes, services, and the eventual product getting from A to B. And that makes it complex for business leaders as well to understand what is the leverage. So what we do at SQUAKE and how we approach this is really establishing an end-to-end sense of what needs to be done first, setting up understanding about the past, then second, setting targets for the future, and then committing step by step into the action. And there is multiple ways how to calculate the return on invest when it comes to sustainability and reducing carbon emissions, which is obviously a case-by-case analysis, but it is fairly straightforward and there is return. So the connotation or perception that sustainability is just coming at a price and there's no return to a business is just plain wrong. And that is where we start picking top management up in terms of understanding what can be done and how it can be done to align sustainability and the financial and economical considerations a company and a business leader has to combine, basically. And that's where our approach comes in, and our solution suite is equipped for.
That's fantastic. I'm excited to continue to follow SQUAKE. And as I said in the beginning of this interview, I genuinely saw it and thought, wow, okay, that's really, really something, especially having worked in technology in the business travel industry. So I urge everyone to go and check it out and get in contact with SQUAKE, SQUAKE for anyone that's thinking about it. But Philip, thank you so much. I really, really enjoyed this conversation, and I think a lot of people, certainly a lot of my connections, will really find this of interest. So I appreciate your time. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much for having me.
Okay, have a good day.
You too.